Hi, I'm Melissa Reader. Welcome to Agehood, the podcast for people who are quietly carrying it all. Aging parents, adult kids, work, life, and their own next chapter. And if this is sounding like you, well, you're in your agehood, and it's time that we talked about it. I've admired my guest today for a long time. Holly Ransom is one of Australia's most dynamic leaders. She's really globally sought after as a speaker and a strategist. She's CEO of her own company, Emergent. She's a best-selling author. She's also the youngest person ever appointed to run a G20 task force. It's a pretty impressive CV, having interviewed the Obamas, the world's top CEOs and Fortune 500 leaders. But in today's episode, we speak about not power, but about something far more personal. We're talking about grief. After the death of her beloved grandmother, Dorothy, who was the woman who really helped shape Holly's worldview and taught her the power of empathy, courage, and doing what's right, Holly found herself unexpectedly untethered. And it was in that experience that she found her way to Violet and the work that we do. In today's episode, Holly opens up about her first real experience with loss, the life lessons that Dorothy taught her, and why she's still on Holly's speed dial. We also talk about what it means to lead with empathy, how to meet people where they are, and why we urgently need to get better at preparing for and talking about the final chapters of life. Holly Ransom, welcome to Agehood.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's so good to have you here. I mean, I have followed your career with such interest and admiration for the last few years. It's not all females, particularly Aussie females, that get out there on the world stage and interview the Obamas and Richard Branson and the like.
Very fortunate.
And also your work as CEO of Emergent. So much I want to unpack with you today around your own story, but also how some of these issues around life and love and loss and grief play out in the workplace. Let's start a little bit by, how we got connected. That was quite an interesting little moment of serendipity, I guess.
It was, wasn't it? So grateful for people who are thoughtful enough to make recommendations, particularly when you're in those vulnerable moments. And our wonderful friend Sharon,
yes.
Who you had supported with everything you do at Violet through the passing of her mum, who was so near and dear to her. She and I were having, I can't remember whether it's coffee or lunch in Sydney shortly after the passing of my beloved grandmother, Dorothy, which was really the first time I had lost anyone where I'd say, grief was all of a sudden very present in my life. I'm very fortunate to be able to say that as someone in their 30s, but this just knocked me for six. And I felt very at sea, and Sharon and I were talking about it and sort of sharing stories of her mother and my grandmother, and she sort of said, oh, well, who really helped me? Sort of held my hand as I was taking these first few steps through the loss of my mum was the team at Violet. You should reach out and connect. And so that's how it all got started. And I met you and then had a couple of conversations with Bernadette from the Violet team. Because it's sort of this funny thing, isn't it? When you think about how part of the human experience grief is. None of us get through life without grief.
How totally universal this is.
Absolutely. And yet you can arrive at it feeling so ill-equipped.
Yeah.
And that was how it happened. You kind of know when your grandparents are in their 90s that you're coming towards, saying goodbye. And my grandpa passed away, a year before my grandmother did. And so I sort of had always anticipated she would die of a broken heart. In many ways, she lasted a little bit longer than I thought she would. They'd been together nearly just shy of 71 years when he passed, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
Incredible love story. And so it's coming. And then still nothing takes away from the just devastation and vortex you feel like you fall into when they finally leave.
Yeah, totally at sea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the only way I can describe it, just feeling at sea and sort of not sure which way to swim or how to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So true. And we just don't have the language or the narrative or the kind of mental models, do we, for grief?
Totally. That's another thing you noticed, and I hope I'm doing better at this for people that I'm supporting through grief subsequently, but I could really tell the people in my life who'd experienced grief.
So interesting that you should say that.
Because you made me think of it when you said language, the way they messaged, like the words they used, this kind of understanding or this language, in the way that poets can put language around human emotion, you could tell people who'd felt it and experienced it and were reaching out to you from kind of that shared understanding of what you were in. And no disrespect to the thoughtfulness of anyone reaching out, irrespective. You're so grateful for every little bit of human connection in those moments. Yeah. But there was this real way that people who had experienced grief in my life were with me in that moment that was huge.
That's so true. And I think so often it's about the things that maybe aren't said by those that have been through it as much as the things that are said.
Yeah.
Lived experience is at the very, very heart of this. Can you tell us a little bit about Dorothy? She sounded like a pretty amazing woman.
She was a remarkable woman.
About her, about your relationship.
Yeah.
How would we get to know Dorothy a little?
I love that you asked this question, because one of the things that I learnt through Bernadette and through working with Violet was the importance of still telling her stories and finding ways. And I'm getting better at it. I actually spoke about her on stage for the first time since she passed last week. And so I'm getting to a place emotionally now where I feel I can do it. And it's so important to me because I want my daughter, who's unfortunately never got to meet her great-grandmother, to grow up knowing her and to really have a sense of who she was and to be inspired to be like her great-grandmother, because she was a remarkable human being. You know, I think the thing when I think about my grandmother, well, several things that come to mind. One was she had this incredible superpower that it did not matter who she was talking to, she would make them feel like the world is so lucky that they are on the planet and they are doing exactly what they've chosen to do, because isn't that the perfect thing for them to be spending their time doing? And there was just this way people left her presence feeling like they're 11 foot tall. And I remember watching that with people at the library, people at the shops in the country town that they lived in, the guys at the surf club. She just had this incredible way of making people feel better than when she met them. And I always thought that was such an incredible gift to give someone, and an incredible way to have impact with every interaction. There's nothing about title or
rank,
money or hierarchy or that is within anyone's sphere of influence and control, but not many people seized it like my grandmother did and were as deliberate about it. And she had quite an incredible ripple effect in the world by virtue of that. One of the funniest things about my grandparents, I've not shared this too many places, but they co-wrote the original sex book. So
really?
Yeah, you didn't know that one. So
I mean, I was going to talk about what you had role modelled in terms of your grandmother's ability
but
to
this
talk
is
to
incredible
people.
too.
This is a whole new part.
A whole new part. So they wrote Sexual Joy in Marriage, you can go Google it, by Michael and Dorothy Clark.
Wow.
And which we thought was like the coolest as grandkids. Yeah. Like I remember as a teenager finding the book on the shelf and I was like, Grandma and Grandpa wrote a book, and pulled it down book? And my eyes popped out of my head for about a week. But, Grandpa had been a psychiatrist. He had come to form the opinion that a lot of his patients were presenting with challenges that ultimately stem back to an inability to get into intimacy and to really be able to ask for and get what they needed from their most important partnership. And so I remember, Grandma sort of telling the story that he decided to, after many years of practicing, write down sort of some of the things that he'd come to observe as sort of almost the blueprint for couples to be able to have thriving relationships. And Grandma read the draft. She's like, Michael, don't be ridiculous. That's not how women think at all. And so, credit to my grandpa, like I think in many ways ahead of his time in so many regards. They co-wrote it together and they went all around the world. Like they lectured YPO, kings, queens.
What year? When was this published?
It would have been the 80s. Yeah. It predates me. Incredible. So they were also really, as you'd imagine, with two grandparents that spend their time doing that and have these incredible sort of next life after they've raised their kids of sort of these intellectually stimulating conversations and traveling around the world, having Grandpa was a very funny raconteur and apparently brought this to life in amazing ways on stages. So I like to think I've got a little bit of him in sort of what I do now to some degree. But incredibly liberal and open-minded. And that's another thing I loved about my grandma, even as late as, in her final 24 months. We would talk a lot about world affairs and politics, and she was always very interested when I was interviewing someone, in that category of people. And we would talk a lot on International Women's Day about how much, she couldn't fathom the choices women of my generation were able to make. She got the choice of you a nurse, a typist, or a teacher when you came out of school, and you had to leave all of that when you had kids, right? So it's amazing in 2 generations, sort of some of the things I'm able to do now that her generation paved the way for. But she would still call me and she'd say, you know what, when we were talking yesterday about insert whatever political issue or something, you really made me think differently about that. And I deeply admired her ability to change her opinion and to be open-minded. As late in her life as you probably could have said, she could have entirely calcified and had a very fixed worldview. She would still call me and say, you really made me think differently about that. And I hope I can be that open-minded, when I get to her stage of life. But there's so many things. Like, she was my first teacher about what it meant to be a leader. And what I loved about it is she always led by example, never by telling. And there are so many stories, many of which are in my book, The Leading Edge.
Shared
and
quite
others.
a few of those which have been...
Yeah.
She obviously played a hugely formative role.
Massively.
For you.
Massively.
What do you think Dorothy saw in you before you even saw it in yourself?
Oh, a lot. Your grandma's joke about me was always that I was born in perpetual motion. And so I think she had she believed I could do anything. And I really felt that. She was the first person I would call when something exciting would happen. I'm getting emotional talking about that because I still refuse to take her off my speed dial. She's still next to my wife, the sort of second in rank, even though I know that number goes nowhere now. But, I'd call, and Grandpa unfortunately lost his hearing well before he passed away. So he would write great emails. He loved, email was a gift to him because he could remain in communication with the world he would have otherwise lost contact with a decade before he passed. And so I've got a folder of his emails, but I've got a phone full of her voicemails.
Oh, have you?
Oh, yeah. And even I go back every now and again and listen to the one she left me on, the day I married my wife, and she was unfortunately not of the health to be able to travel to the wedding, and or birthdays or things like that are just so lovely to be able to hear her voice still.
And there's a whole science behind that around
Yeah.
continuing bonds. It's
Yeah.
again, it's not something that we really understand or kind of talk about broadly, but it's so important because I think for so many there's a sense that that person has to be removed.
Yes.
That there can be a trace in a cemetery,
Yeah.
but that person is removed, and there is such deep and very real attachment that you need to learn to translate into the next chapter of your relationship with Dorothy. I love the fact that she's still on your speed dial.
Yeah, and I don't know, she probably will forever be, you know what I mean? And mistakenly, actually, the other week I called the number and it rang out, it didn't go anywhere. But it was just funny how that happened. And with Grandpa, like he could look at the night sky and he could tell you every star in the galaxy. Didn't need a phone app to do that. He would be able to look up and tell you the stories. And so I often think when I look up the stars, it's him. And many ways that's become part of where both of them are for me, and probably fitting that we called our daughter Aurora, in terms of the beautiful skies and something quite extraordinary. But yeah, I think there's often, all of us can think about that person in our life who made us believe before we had it ourselves or before we even knew there was much to believe in. And I think for me, she was that. Time and time again, she saw there as being no bounds to what I could do, an incredible source of support. You'd call her on the days where you felt flat, you'd call her on the days where you felt excited. She always had a way of knowing exactly how to meet you where you are. And I wouldn't be the person I am if it weren't for her.
What a gift. Do you still want to call her on those days if you might have done a huge interview? Do you want to just tell Dorothy that you spoke to the Obamas today?
There's so many times. I actually remember thinking last year when I was doing an event, I co-founded an energy summit in Canada, and on the speaking bill last year we had Jacinda Ardern and Sana Marin, two women who had led countries under the age of 40. And I just remember thinking, I'd love to have this conversation with my grandmother. Imagine getting to tell her that we live in a like I've spoken to two women that led entire nations before they turned 40. Like what a fascinating intergenerational conversation to have. So absolutely, there are people that I would love to still be able to, share those stories with her about, or get her take on on them and what I should ask, and absolutely, and that will continue forever and a day, I'm sure.
And it's almost like your career progression and the kind of societal change and the progress that's happening alongside of that are just they're quite intertwined, aren't they?
Definitely. Yeah.
You said, I've heard you say that she never really lectured you or told you what to do, just lived her values. What's a lesson or a phrase that is kind of a reading from Dorothy's book?
Oh, there's a couple. I mean, one for me that was really formative early was when we were at the shops I grew up in Perth in Western Australia, and my grandparents lived on the beach in Scarborough, and we were down at the local shopping centre getting some supplies for lunch. Grandma was babysitting myself and my older of my two younger brothers that day. And I remember we were in the line to the checkout, and this guy that looked like a giant, I would have been 4 or 5 years old, had started chewing into this poor young woman on the checkout because she'd evidently given him the wrong change. And for whatever was going on in that guy's life that day, he'd taken real issue with it. And I remember being very young, and I remember her cheeks being absolutely flush crimson. Like she looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. She was so mortified and equally probably a little bit terrified. And before I could blink, like my grandmother was not a tall woman, but she had inserted herself between the giant and this young lady on the checkout. Said to this guy, "How dare you talk to that young woman like that? You apologise." And this guy looked like he'd never been told off in his life, and he sort of, took a moment or two to take that in, and then grabbed his things and sort of mumbled sorry and walked out of the store. And, Grandma proceeded like nothing had happened, bought bread and milk and whatever else we were getting, and sort of went to walk out of the shops before she realised, like, I wasn't still standing in lockstep with her. I was stuck back in the queue, sort of having watched all this played out, probably with my jaw on the floor. And she came back to grab my hand, and I said, "Grandma, that was so brave." And she said to me, "Honey, if you walk past it, you tell the world it's okay." And I didn't understand what that meant for a long time after she shared that with me. But it didn't need to, because she showed me. Like, my grandma wasn't manager of the store. She wasn't even the same height as this guy. There's a lot of reasons where she would have been forgiven for looking the other way, pretending like it didn't happen, whatever. And here she was inserting herself, with a choice she could make to say, that's not okay, and I'm not prepared to let that slide. And so for me, I think, one, that role modelling of the everyday choices that we can make, whether that's putting our hand up and asking the question in the room, whether that's stepping in when someone's not being treated well. She did that time and time again, but seared in my memory is always that one in particular. And then I think the second thing was really that she'd done that without title, without permission, that power is within any of us. And that, for me, became a decisive sort of guiding phrase in many ways through my life. Like, a lot of my choices have been, whether it was getting involved in certain charitable organisations, whether it was picking what to say yes to or no to, were determined by sort of asking that question, can I walk past this?
I think there's something really interesting in that story that links to disruption. And leadership around disruption, because the status quo is the walking away, isn't it? The status quo is, bad day for the guy, bad day for the girl, off I go. But whether that's that little moment where Dorothy had the wherewithal and the character to intervene, and then, I'm kind of threading the needle on that into the work that I have seen you talk about and be so involved with around parts of business, parts of the not-for-profit sector that are no longer okay, that need that moment of stepping up and looking at things with a different lens and a different light.
Well, I'd even be intrigued on like how that resonates for your story with Violet, right?
Well, that's exactly what is all rolling through my mind. Yeah,
was sort of that ability to go when you found yourself in, just unspeakable difficulty and tragedy and loss, the choice to go, I don't want others to go through this alone, and I don't
Yeah.
mean that disrespectfully of the support structure that you had in your
No.
corner.
No, but I think
But there's a
individually
systemic-
you feel incredibly alone and unprepared and overwhelmed.
Totally. And you've been so deliberate about, there's a system approach that's needed here. Support needs to be, wrapped around this. There's processes, there's ways that we know that we can't expect people to know without this institutional knowledge being shared and sort of designed in a way that can scale meaningfully to reach people.
And I think there's another dimension to that, which I've had to give a lot of time and attention and grit to over the years, because in doing this work, I'm taking a conversation into people's homes, into people's TV stations, into boardrooms that a lot of people don't want to have and don't want to hear. So there's a lot of classic deauthorization, marginalising, turn off that channel that I've experienced, and that's been bloody tough.
Yeah.
Particularly as a woman. Particularly, I found as a woman in my 40s trying to take that change to, different leadership styles in different industries that were less open to change. That was probably the hardest bit for me. So I never really questioned the need for the work and that it was going to become my work.
Could I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Because I think there's such an interesting tension there. There's something I've learned to balance with that great line from Grandma of walking past it is also this piece around sort of the for the want of a slightly better phrase, to be honest, because it's a little more nuanced than this, but that Einstein one of the definition of insanity is thinking I can keep doing the same thing and get a different result. So this element of like, I'm not going to walk past it, but I'm going to have to keep showing up slightly differently. I'm going to have to adapt my strategies and my ways of working. How have you done that to help keep people's ears open and hearts open to actually hearing what you want to talk about?
Some of it's been quite tactical around language.
So like words not to use and words to use?
Yeah. So, and we even did the rebrand around this. So, if I had relaunched as the Good Death Company, not sure that many people would have been ready to look at that, maybe 3 or 5%. People need to talk about death with clarity, but it's not the place that they can start talking about it. So we've learnt a lot about building a brand and a community and a language that is quite safe and reassuring, that lets people in at a pace they can tolerate.
Interesting.
There's a lot of interesting leadership
There's a lot
stuff.
of message testing in that too, right?
And talking about the last chapters of life, the last stages of life. You're almost trying to just switch people's minds forward a few steps around reflection and awareness. And of course, this is about the end of someone's life. Of course, this is about the ubiquity of death. But it's my view that we can't start there.
Well, also what I hear in that too is there's a real a delicacy of the choice of words. Like it's got to be gentler and softer. And sometimes I think when you are disrupting or trying to change something, we think the shortcut is to be blunter and more direct. And I can imagine that would have been challenged, because you're right, like there's no avoiding what we're actually talking about here, but the pathway to get people to be open enough to sit in the conversation, to think about how to change the game, we might have to go softly and, go about it in a more nuanced manner than maybe would in your own head. You're kind of
classic disruption conversation. Yeah. But you mentioned Dorothy saying she met the person where they were.
Yes.
That is what this is about.
Yeah.
So if I'm a woman in my 50s caring for my mum, and mum might be in her 80s and quite well today, but I have to start to understand that mum is entering the last 5 or 10 years potentially of her life. How do we start to talk about that at the kitchen table with love and trust and familiarity, and how do we make a plan for that chapter of all of our lives rather than leaving that conversation to the time when mum's had a fall or ends up in hospital and we're incredibly stressed and we've lost that opportunity. So there's a kind of a preparation mindset, that is trying to do this work in advance. And then there's also doing this work in very real moments of need where someone is in hospital, has gone into residential care and their health is quite rapidly declining. So it's tough, but there's a lot of Dorothy in that. Definitely the meet people where they are is very, very...
There's a lot to that.
It's very, very true. Tell me a little bit about the last couple of years of Dorothy's life. So I've learnt from this conversation that her husband died only a year before she died, did you say?
Yep.
What was that like for you? What were you starting to think about or notice about Dorothy in those last couple of years?
I think the difference between grandpa and grandma's passing, grandpa's physical health declined quite rapidly in a surprising manner because he was a really fit man till he wasn't. Like it did really happen quite quickly. In the sense that my grandpa in his 80s would still be starting the day with 100 full body push-ups and an hour of yoga. Like he was a
That's
very
impressive.
fit guy. He played golf every week. It was really impressive. And yoga, he considered to be one of the great gifts his retirement gave him because he took up yoga when he retired and he really was. He was strong and fit. I remember quite famously, I can't remember how old he would have been. I think I would have been a teenager though. And I had a lot of male cousins who were, surfers and footballers and all this sort of stuff like that. And Grandpa pulled out a hand press where he lifted his whole body off the floor and he said $50 to whoever could do it. And not one of nobody could do it.
Grandpa.
For all these people that were fit athletes playing in competitive teams and all this sort of stuff, he was the one that could get that done. So he spent a good chunk of his final. I'm probably guessing now. It's amazing how timelines start to disappear on you when you get to this stage of life. So I could be a little off here, but a year, 18 months in sort of hospice care, beautiful place down the road from where they lived in Denmark, country WA. Truly, like, visited him a number of times there and just wonderful nurses. He could look out the window at, his town every day and take in nature and... So Grandma's life became shuffling down there. However many times a day she could get someone to give her a lift to go and sit at his bedside and talk to him to the degree that could happen. And I think that's what's interesting when he passed is the loss of that routine, in many ways, and because. Well, it's not a wonderful routine to have to go and watch your partner decline like that, and it's
an anchor.
It's an anchor,
and it's the next version of their marriage and
he's
relationship.
Still
there.
And And there was something about, I still remember a conversation, and it was one that we had when he moved into hospice, and it was one that we had again when he passed. Of sort of, after 70 years, probably at that stage, he was already in hospice care when they had their 70th, so it must have been just before. But she's like, I rolled over and we've talked about the day before it started. Like, he has always been next to me in bed. Like, to not be able to have that anchor, to use the word you just used, was a real sense of loss. I think that was the first time. And it's funny how those little things, in many ways, are the bits we notice. Like that just grounding routine
grief.
Every morning. That was what we did. And that was the first time I remember her really... She was stoic. Women of that generation are just something else. They are remarkable, and I think, like, I'm very fortunate. My wife's got two grandparents, both in their 90s, both still going strong. They're remarkable women of that generation that lived through wars and depressions and just get on and get it done and are just so selfless. And she was really stoic, but I do remember vividly having a conversation about that. And the great gift in some ways for my grandmother was she spent very little of her life in any kind of care. For her, when it happened much quicker.
I was going to ask you, was she living independently?
She was living independently till very late. And I say this, my auntie is a saint. It would not have been possible were it not for her incredible commitment to both of them and to keeping them home for as long as they could have. And she lives down in the town. She was there every day. She would do the shopping. She would, shuffle Grandma down to see Grandpa. She did everything. My Auntie Sally was remarkable. So that made it possible for as long as it did. And I feel very grateful that she was able to live in their beautiful home for as long as she did. And in many ways, I guess that it happened quicker than it could have otherwise.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point because we know that, 90% of us actually, we want to be at home for as long as we can be, and that makes complete sense. I don't think anybody ever argues that point. But it's thinking about how that's going to be made possible and what kind of a plan is going to, need to be developed and talked about, and how you're kind of going to put that into action.
Yeah.
Because you look at the research in the last 12 months of a person's life, and there's a lot of preventable hospitalisation, about 33 days, 4 episodes, and when you peel back the layers of that, A lot of that comes from a lack of conversation and decision making. So again, it's those crisis moments we're not prepared for.
Totally.
We're not thinking about and understanding where someone is in their life's chapter, and we're
Yeah.
not making the decisions that reflect what they want.
And kudos
Such a
as
big
well
part of
to the
it.
services that exist to support those choices. Like when I
Yeah.
think about Silver Chain,
Oh, Silver Chain,
Yeah.
an amazing
unbelievable.
organisation.
And those nurses that came, every week, the carers that came every week to help shower her and help, do odd jobs and make sure she had a cup of tea in the morning and, this and that. Like they also make,
Absolutely. Silver Chain, because of their
Saints.
work, a much higher proportion of people die at home in WA than in any other state.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Much, much higher. It's about less than 15% anywhere else.
Wow.
And it's about 60, higher than 60. I haven't got the exact number, but it's much, much higher because of the work they do and also because of the kind of geographic reality of WA.
Yeah,
It's probably
okay.
those two
That
things
makes sense
combined.
as well. Yeah, because it really was there's only certain options available. I felt very grateful that Grandpa could stay in Denmark, for example, and not have to go to the next biggest regional town, where the challenge for my grandmother would have been a 45-plus minute drive to get to the hospital every day versus 5 minutes down the road. And so, yeah, those things do make a difference. The geographical disbursement of WA is definitely a medical challenge for sure.
But also, as you've said, calling out the incredible work those services do and
Oh,
investing in
absolutely.
them.
Hugely.
Because when we look at the ageing population and the quite disparate nature of those services, a lot of that caregiving role is going to fall on the shoulders of your Auntie Sally and those kind of midlife women
Yeah.
caring for parents who are ageing and in-laws.
Definitely.
It's just a big
I mean,
part
this
of
is
the
why the
reality.
conversation you're driving, I think, is so important because, not only are we not talking enough about death and kind of that final stage of life, but the everything that is needed to support the ageing population. We're living longer. We're not necessarily living with vitality for longer. We're starting to get our heads a little bit more around that conversation and funding and everything now. But we've seen an extraordinary expansion in lifespan in Western society.
We've never had to think about this type of longevity before, which is a brilliant.
Completely.
Bernard Salt calls it the novel dilemma.
The novel dilemma. Love it. He's always got a phrase for it,
He's
Bernard.
He's
He's so
the
good.
wordsmith. That's
He
right.
is.
But it's a very positive thing.
Yes.
But we haven't really
Grappled with it.
thought about it, reckoned with it.
Yeah.
As a society in terms of conversations and planning and the infrastructure that's required.
And also the economic reality. Like, I work a lot in the intergenerational space and have done for, a decade in different policy settings. And we talk a lot about millennials, now even more so with Gen Z, sort of the challenges of, getting into the housing market, the capital available for care, should and when that be required. I've had a number of friends navigate having parents with high care needs that have had to go into like relatively high level like facilities where they've needed support for MND and MS and things like that in recent times. With quite a long trajectory potentially still ahead of them. That's a significant financial reality for the family to lean into at a time where, you're potentially in your first home with a significant mortgage or, raising your kids and paying off the mortgage and now thinking about how to do this. So
or kids, at uni who can't afford to move out of home because
100%.
of the affordability issues. And
this is all it, right?
it is all. It's so interesting that you raise that because we're releasing a report this Thursday, so that will have already been released by the time this goes to air, called the Care Index.
Yeah, right.
Which is the caregiving and ageing readiness evaluation.
And how did we come up as a scorecard?
We didn't do well.
Okay.
We didn't do well. We measured it across the preparation, the care contradiction, the kind of paradox between loving deeply but not having a plan in place, the emotional toll, the relationship strain, and the competing demands.
Interesting.
So those types of measures have not been analysed previously. We look at much more technical, often clinical measures around this stage of life. So we did not do well. We scored 23 out of 100. But what I want to bring to that conversation is not an it's all broken,
Yep.
let's kind of boil the ocean. We've got a really clear two-step response framework. There is a way to do this. There are government funded programs that are already in place but very underutilised. So it just feels like a point in time to be putting the heat under that because it's like a five-fold increase in the next 5 years of people turning 85.
So I want everyone to go read the full report, but can you give a little succinct summary of the two-step sort of things we need to be more focused on?
Yeah. With pleasure, Holly. I get a little pitch right here.
No, I genuinely want to hear it. I'm going to go read it.
First of all, it's investing in our model.
Yeah,
so
okay.
we've been spending 5 years validating and scaling a nationwide model, tech-enabled, which has all of the evidence-based support programs that you spoke to, as well as technology support for planning and access to services. So it's actually quite a small amount of money we're asking government to invest in the scaling of that, really to lift our infrastructure so we can deliver at a much greater scale. That's number one. I hope all the right ears are listening to this. Number two is the Carer Gateway.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of that?
No.
And this is part of the problem. It's a federally funded program. It's had over $1 billion flowing into it in the last 5 years.
Wow. How have I not heard of it? That's not an insignificant amount of money.
Not at all, particularly with the elder care demand, right? So the fact that it's called Carer Gateway, I think is part of its problem because we don't see ourselves as carers.
Yeah.
You were Dorothy's granddaughter. I was Mara's wife. You know, we're a husband, a son.
Yeah.
We're not, like carers is just not a label we identify with.
Yep.
So I don't think a lot of people kind of attached to the service. It's a fantastic service that people can get, but it's underutilised, seriously underutilised. So I think by working more closely with the Carer Gateway and bringing initiatives into the community and into the workplaces to get the sandwich generation of carers the support they need, that's not requiring massive investment or infrastructure. It's leveraging what's already out there that's underutilised.
Interesting. Well, I hope there's
So we'll be having some good conversations about that on Thursday at Parliament House.
Excellent. I look forward to hearing how that goes.
I'm going to use this little segment for a bit of promotion of that. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's go back to Dorothy. Tell me how things were for you, because you're in the middle of your career rise, I guess, as all this is happening. You're a busy lady. What was it looking like for you as she started to become less independent, less well?
Well, I mean, we to begin with lived in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
And, Denmark is 4.5 hours drive south of Perth. So it's not the easiest place to get to. And anyone who lived through COVID in Victoria, as we did, and I was in the US when COVID hit, so sort of came back, meant to be on spring break from my master's program, got locked down. 48 hours later, the hard border went up, got locked in Victoria for the COVID pandemic. So for a good sort of 3 years of, my grandparents' final stages, you actually couldn't get there. And so that was challenging. You're so grateful that we have the assists that we do in the sense of my grandpa had email. Yeah. My grandma had the phone. They weren't quite... Grandpa actually started to dabble in social media in his later days. Not well. You'd get these things where Grandpa had somehow posted a blank image to Instagram or something. I don't know what buttons he'd press to do it, but they were very good at sort of tracking things. They understand well enough how to sort of often say, "Oh, I've seen that photo and so." So that was lovely. They weren't quite across how to use FaceTime and things like that. So those things you sort of needed to have someone there that knew how to use those devices to have the chat with you almost as such. But that was... It was hard. I tried to get over when I could. I'm very grateful for the family that played roles in sort of holding the phones up and allowing me to connect and, having those moments of like in the pandemic when my first ever book came out, and my grandparents were both voracious readers, and my grandpa was particularly very proud. His father had been an author. He was immensely proud of the idea that was going to continue somewhere in the family lineage. He wasn't well enough to be able to read by the time the book came out, but I've got an image of sort of him holding it, opening it in the hospital with grandma and, crying. And I'm grateful for the family that made that moment possible, because I couldn't get into WA, let alone down to them at that moment in time. So very grateful for all those moments afforded, the opportunity my auntie gave me to say goodbye to my grandmother at the very end on the phone, in the hospital, sort of knowing that was imminent, to be able to hear her say, "I'm so proud of you." That will stick with me forever, being afforded the opportunity to say goodbye and tell how much I loved her one last time, So hard, yes. No harder than anyone else finds. I think whatever way you're interacting with losing someone you love, like whether you're there every day or whether you're half a world away, those things I think have their own degrees of challenge and difficulty that comes with it. But so grateful at the same time for the fact that technology afforded all these ways to stay connected, even as, my life took me to other parts of the world and and my career made it very challenging to get back to their pocket of the world with the frequency that, would love teleporting to be invented.
Of course.
But,
and even just the difficulty in saying goodbye.
Yeah.
But the possibility that could happen.
Yeah, exactly. So you count your blessings for each of those opportunities for sure.
What was it like after her death for you?
I think like before I'd met my wife, I would have said grandma was sort of my person, and in the sense of always seemed to make the world make sense, was that person that you would call and share news with, always wanted to hear what was going on, always had, an interesting reflection or something to share. And so I think the loss of that has a great gravity to it. Hence why things like I just won't remove her from my speed dial and stuff like that, because instinctively I like to think that she's still there. I think it was the best way I can describe it. It was a little bit lost at sea. Like I was really emotional. I found it very hard to not cry for a period of time afterwards. Like anytime I think about her, you just start crying. And then certainly anytime you talk about her or anything like that would sort of, bring that to the fore again. My wife was incredible as, support through that period. Incredibly grateful for, friends that really understood what that was like and were able to be incredible ballast, at that point in time. And equally grateful for the Violet team for new strategies and techniques. Like I needed to hear stuff like the importance of talking about her and the importance of, one of the things my grandma and I did together all the time. And I think part of why I love it so much is bake. Like my grandma was an incredible cook. But the thing I always loved doing with her was baking. And, Bernadette's advice, I remember at the time, was like, don't just bake, but when you bake, tell the story of the time you made it with grandma and she, made it for a special occasion, or you've mixed the salt and the sugar and it turned out terribly, or whatever it is that kind of makes sure she keeps alive alongside the recipes. So I try to be really deliberate about that with my daughter now.
I was just going to say what a beautiful ritual,
totally.
to bring in for your daughter. In fact, my sister's partner, Erin, we had Christmas in July last week, and she made the Christmas pudding, and she was telling me a very similar story. Her mum died a couple of years ago, and her mum always did the pudding, and then she handed it to Erin.
Yeah.
In those last few months, she said, this is yours, take it forward. And it's important, isn't it? Because
totally.
Those rituals, those meanings, the things that those people have brought to us, and then you can pass on.
Absolutely.
Very precious.
And one of the things I'd done on a school, we spent a lot of our school holidays down at their place when we were younger. And I think when I was 9 or 10, Grandma was a messy cook, which I've also inherited. And so the Stephanie Alexander and all the different cookbooks had a good amount of splattering with sort of stuff all over them. And for whatever reason, I decided to make a recipe book for Grandma of all her best recipes.
Oh, before she died, you did this?
Well, this is as a 10-year-old. So this is a long time ago.
Oh.
And so it was in one of those things where, you had the plastic sleeves and I'd put it all together and it was all categorized by, I don't know, very cool 10-year-old, clearly, doing this in secret on the computer and then printing it all out and presenting it to her at the end. And I even wrote a foreword. Like, honestly, you should see this.
There was a budding author in that.
Oh, my God.
Wasn't there?
But an incredible surprise, and I think still the most thoughtful gift I have ever been given. Our 1-year wedding anniversary was 3 months after Grandma passed. And the first anniversary is paper. And my wife, while I'd been away on a trip, had gone and, because Grandma had given me the book, the last time I saw her before she passed, she'd given me the book I'd made for her all those years ago back because she wanted that to travel with me. But it was in tatters, as you might. Very loved. It had 20 plus years of being used every meal.
Kitchen mess.
Oh, all the kitchen mess. And so my wife had gone and typed it all up and made this most beautifully bound book so that the recipes could continue with our daughter. And so I'm particularly grateful for, the fact that we really do. We have her recipes in this beautiful bound book that I'll get to cook with Aurora forever and a day.
That's pretty precious, isn't it?
It's really special.
If you were, thinking about, I guess, listeners to this podcast, probably a lot of people who are either living this experience now, caring for loved ones who may be aging or maybe dealing with serious illness. They may be in it or they may know that it's ahead of them. What would you say to those people? A lot of them are going to be women. What have you learnt or taken away from your experience with Dorothy that you'd want to share?
I think to the degree that don't leave anything unsaid. I certainly feel very grateful that I felt like we always had a very open, caring relationship. But I feel so grateful that my grandma knew I loved her. I took every opportunity I could to speak with her. I think those moments are so precious, and I've had a number of friends who've stepped back from various commitments recently in order to more full-time care for aging parents and for close family who are at that stage of life. And the conversation a number of us have had in recent weeks reflecting on that is you never regret that time spent. And I know it's a privilege to be able to make that choice. Not everyone can. But in whatever way you can seize your moments to make sure you get the time, the memories, the nothing left unsaid, I think that would be my biggest reflection. And then I think from a grief standpoint, if and when people find themselves at that stage, it's really that awareness that everyone grieves differently. And it's to the best of your ability going easy on yourself and allowing yourself to work out your timing will be different to the person next to you's. What you need and when you need it will look different to the person next to you. But don't grieve alone. Like, there are resources like Violet. There are friends that are there. It does make a difference to have support. And I think sometimes when we're grieving, we want to just batten down the hatches and put the doona over our head and kind of just hope that it gets better tomorrow. And the thing I've learned is you do need some strategies. You do need to find ways to talk. You do need to be able to be deliberate about things that you're doing to, put a smile on your face and to be able to look after yourself through what can be a really challenging time. So if I have, anything to share, it'll be those two things.
And it is okay to feel the emotion too, isn't it? And I did this terribly in the couple of years after Mara's death. That the kind of the veneer or the facade of I'm okay serves you well sometimes, but can also really get in the way. And so just allowing yourself to feel those feelings when they're there and find those bonds and those ways back to Dorothy's number in your phone, I think that's a really important message for people as well.
Definitely agree. I think you can, we can be very judgy about expressing emotion, like in our society. And I think that you're right, like that I remember someone saying to me in the bowels of sort of grief that, grieving is, or kind of really feeling that grief is a reflection of how much you love someone. Yeah. Like to grieve is to know love and love deeply. And so I think it's something to not be surprised by at all and to not be hard on ourselves for. It's an outpouring of your love for someone that mattered a lot to you and whose life you were intertwined with to some way, some way, shape or form for a very long period of time. And then, I completely agree that notion of, you need to do for yourself what you need to practice some self-care. There's an element of, allowing yourself to feel and then allowing yourself to know that's perfectly okay. And the way that you're working through it is the best way you know how.
Completely. Today and tomorrow and next week and in 5 years and 10 years. So true. I'm really interested in your thoughts on the rise of the kind of elder care role that is just going to become such a part of the fabric of our society over the next decade and what that is going to look like in a workplace context. It's again, it's linked to some of this research that we've been looking at around very high prevalence of people who are going to be taking on these roles and what that might mean for their career advancement, juggling all those multiple roles. And in particular, I think about the key worker kind of industries of teachers and healthcare workers and aged care workers and how many of those workers are women. I'm not going to spurt all the data back at you. Everyone can read that in the report. But how do you think about that, given all the work you do and the kind of context of both workplace culture, the kind of soft side of that, but also the more technical side of it around policy and the way workplaces can think about and support those people?
Yeah, I think it's a conversation where very early days in, if at all. It feels very embryonic, right? Like, I know increasingly it's not uncommon to have carers leave and for that to be something that you're aware that people are accessing. But when I think about carers leave and the allocation of carers leave and then some of the caring realities that I've had friends living through at the moment, those two things are not equal.
Not aligned. No.
They've needed to have generosity above and beyond from their employers to be able to support them through, because the number of days that you get from a caring leave perspective doesn't equate to the reality of what you might find yourself needing to support and needing to be able to be there for. So I think there's a very big conversation. This is the reality of the longevity puzzle that we find ourselves in now.
And the role of informal carers, the family members.
Absolutely. And the fact we know that, even in a heteronormative, household with two partners both working, like the majority of caring responsibility is still borne by women. And as we have long described it, it is one aspect, start of life, end of life, all the way through, that invisible care, the component that we don't attribute a value to, that we don't properly understand the burdens of in the way that we need to be thinking through, the policy realities, the working realities, the lack of presenteeism at work when you're contending with that
Precisely, and then
home.
the overall kind of downward pressure that is going to place on our productivity.
Yep.
For me, there's also something interesting in this around permission. So I remember when my kids were very little, it is okay to show up at work and have a big whinge about the fact that your toddler's kept you up all night, or, someone's got the next virus that's come home from daycare. I don't think we have that permission to talk about how hard this caregiving role is. Friends, colleagues, in the workplace, I don't think that's there. I think a lot of people hold that quite stoically and quite quietly.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And I think it's probably another example too of something that we need to get better, a bit like how I think Are You OK Day has given us language and a soft start, to your point earlier around kind of we can't go here first, how do we gradually build our way up to it, into a conversation around how do you actually talk to people about mental health, and also that, well, once you've asked the question and they've given you an answer, like how do you meet them there? Yes. I think there's a piece around that certainly for the caring component where people probably don't know how to have a conversation about it.
That's right.
They don't know how to ask the right questions. They don't know how to be, if you're not living through it. And I think there's also a piece sometimes with this sort of stuff where people sometimes think that work's an outlet, it's an escapism.
Yeah.
You maybe
show up differently at work, and I can almost
and being
have some
busy
distance from
allows
my
you to
reality.
disconnect maybe over here. And I want you to feel like you can talk about it, but I don't want to be the person that's bringing it up and making you think like you've got to if this is an outlet in some ways. And so I think
there's discrimination too that is very much a part of that. If you're kind of managing, reduced sleep and stress, and I think there's some good. The Human Rights Commission did some amazing research around discrimination of that.
Interesting
in the workplace.
But there's no question with the reality of where the demographics of our country are heading, and the realities of what will be required to both support our ageing population, but equally the way we're going to have to think about the very construct of what working looks like, because we're going to have to support more creative ways of staying engaged and staying connected, both to the fabric of community, but also to work itself for longer. Like, the careers are going to have to look different in order for our otherwise much smaller workforce base to support a much larger population. Like, the math stops working. It arguably already has.
I think it has. Yeah. I don't think this is something we're looking at where we're living in.
Yes, I would agree.
Hence the urgency and the...
But with a sort of trajectory that doesn't look better.
No, goodness, we're at the beginning of the wave, but we are definitely on the wave.
Yes.
Last question for you. You have done a lot of work in the space of leading with empathy. You have spoken with and interviewed incredible female leaders, some of who you talked about earlier, who very much hold that concept and frame very closely. What advice do you have for me?
Ooh.
As a woman leading a complex area that still has its own stigma and taboo and that requires a lot of empathy, but is also quite disruptive in its nature, I would love your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, that's a curly one to finish on. What advice would I have? It's funny because I see you doing such an incredible job of it, and so I feel ill-placed to give you advice because I think you're someone that navigates this incredible, delicate dance that is the line of work that you brilliantly described a moment ago so well. I think the thing that I remember this coming up in my conversation with Jacinda Ardern, and when I think about people that I consider to be great leaders with empathy that I've had the privilege of being in conversation with, three come to mind: Brene Brown, Michelle Obama, and Jacinda Ardern, where a big part of our conversation was about empathy. And it came up in different ways. Michelle, I think, is the embodiment of storytelling as a tool for like collective empathy, and the importance of story and the way that we use language in order to bring others along and allow that experience to be allow someone to be brought in to empathy in a way that might not otherwise be as possible with, the way that we can be a bit more us and them or exclusionary with our use of language. But I remember talking to Jacinda about she talks about this idea that empathy, and I forgive me because I'm not going to be anywhere near as eloquent about this topic as she would be in the moment, paraphrasing back what she said. But she talked about the idea of empathy sort of only getting you so far. She talked about specifically showing up to Christchurch after what had happened there with the terrorist event, and how you need to meet it with a plan. And sort of there's this key component around people want you to be there, and you've got to be there so you can really feel what's going on. And I think that speaks to meeting people where they are. But then there's this critical component around, but you need to have the plan for where to and how do you take people on a journey, because they need to feel that combination of being met but having the confidence that their hand was being held by someone who knew where they were going, and that was a critical component to sort of being able to be an effective leader with empathy. You couldn't just live in the feeling. You had to be able to take people forward.
Yeah.
And I come back to that all the time as I think about that topic of sort of how important constantly checking in with myself around the calibration of, am I doing both? Like making sure that I'm not rushing to action without truly seeking first to understand and understand in a felt sense, because I think there is so much about, and this is why I love, she said, you've got to go where the people are. You can't experience what people on the ground in Christchurch are feeling without being there. That's why you get there at first moment, you are with the families, you're with the people that are feeling this. But then there's that second bit of, okay, once we've had those conversations, we need to formulate a plan, and then we need to deliver for those people. And so I actually think you're incredible at doing both these things, but I find that as a useful framework to come back to often around how am I splitting my time as I think about this idea, how am I splitting my energy and focus as I think about storytelling or launches at Parliament, how am I keeping that balance between how do we emotionally allow people in and really feel where they're at and meet this difficult topic thoughtfully, and then how do I be that leader that can take it forward from there? So I don't know that that's direct advice, but I hope it's a useful frame.
It's actually very lovely and very validating and very resonant, because I do think about that a lot, about the like depth and mess of the problem. But if that's the only place you're going to occupy, you're kind of colluding with the problem itself.
Yes.
You've got to connect with the problem and the pain that people are experiencing, and you've got to find a way to take small steps towards a solution.
I often call it problem glorification.
Yeah.
Like we can spend so much time admiring the problem from so many different angles that we forget the job is to move beyond the problem. Yeah. And so I think that's what we're called to do.
Such a good reminder for me to keep my eye on both sides of that. Holly, thank you. What a delight. I love that you threw a few good curly questions back at me.
I didn't realise I was doing it.
Enjoyed. I'm sure you don't. I'm sure it's just how you roll through the world. I've really loved the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.